Greetings, Aibowan, Vanakkam, and Assalamu alaikum. Distinguished guest speakers, comrades, friends, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lionel Bopage. I will be the host of this global rally, ably assisted by messengers Ranjit Veerasinghe and Ajit Rajapaksa. First of all, we acknowledge that this meeting is being coordinated from the traditional lands of the First People of Australia. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and community. We also pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and the elders of other communities. On behalf of the Defend Democracy in Sri Lanka Collective, I warmly welcome you all to this virtual protest rally from all corners of the world. This is a crucial time in the history of Sri Lanka, and we are gravely concerned about the impact the proposed 20th Amendment to the Constitution of Sri Lanka would have on the future of the country and its peoples. And we are not the only ones to feel so. Since 1948, two major political currents in Sri Lanka competed with each other in the name of nation building. One tendency is based on pluralism and democracy. In other words, unity in diversity. The other is based on majoritarian exclusivism and authoritarianism, characterized by strong central government and limited political freedoms. Such autocratic arrangements are the cofactors that enable the socio-economic, political, and cultural dominance by one group over the rest of the society. In Sri Lanka, authoritarianism in the form of an executive presidential system manifestly failed to address the socio-economic and political issues that are still besetting the country. Attempts to dilute or erase the individual, national, cultural, and ethnic identity differences by manipulating, zombifying, or brainwashing the masses in the futile belief that it will help unify us has been a miserable failure. Diversity is inherent in us. History has shown that authoritarian attempts to suppress our diversity has caused calamitous consequences. Social disruptions, riots, protests, violent backlashes, and uprisings have followed. These were cleverly manipulated to generate fascist and fundamentalist tendencies in order to strengthen autocratic governance systems. The common factor that will hold us united would be the acknowledgement of multiplicity and plurality of humanity as opposed to unity or exclusivism. A pluralist society allows people of differing cultures and faiths to live together and accept one another's differences. In this respect, our country has terribly failed. So, we need to pose the question as to how to harmonize the colorful, vastly diverse mosaics of humanity within us to build a viable, responsive, accountable, and mutually complementing system of governance. Nature provides us a model here. Its most fundamental laws maintain balance and equilibrium in a dynamic and turbulent universe. If only we become aware of our inherent selfish, egoistic, exploitative, and sometimes hateful nature, we will be able to synergistically harness, coordinate, and use our strengths for achieving constructive futures. In today's rally, for some of you in the early hours of a Sunday morning, our main focus is to look into the many negative impacts the 20th Amendment to the Constitution will have on Sri Lanka's multi-faith pluralist society. It cannot just be a simple academic or conceptual exercise. The speakers will highlight the ways in which this amendment, if enacted, would impinge upon the governance in terms of transparency, accountability, justice, equality, human rights, freedoms, parliamentary democracy, and people's sovereignty. Please note that there is no allocation made for a Q&A session or a discussion due to time constraints. However, we invite the participants to post their comments and questions. preferably addressed to a specific panelist on the chat line, including your email address. We will endeavor to provide the response as soon as possible after the event. Thank you. Let me now introduce the first panelist of our virtual rally. Professor C.A. Salia earned his doctorate in finance accounting from Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. His research was on bank credit and its potential contribution towards increasing inequality among people. His vision, according to his website, is to address issues related to poverty with the view of uplifting living standards of financially disadvantaged groups in Sri Lanka. Currently, he is professor in banking and finance attached to the Center for E-Research in Auckland. Let us warmly welcome him for his presentation.
Hello, friends. First, let me thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to address this patriotic forum to share my thoughts, views, and analysis about the impact of the proposed 20th Amendment, especially on the accountability and transparency of government institutions. I would also like to thank and appreciate the initiative taken by Dr. Lionel Bopage on behalf of Defend Democracy in Sri Lanka to have this global rally on the proposed 20th Amendment. The easygoing pitch, the 20th Amendment to the Constitution of Sri Lanka is the title of this presentation. I will focus on three key elements with regard to the following issues. What are the relevant sections in the 19th Amendment with regards to accountability and transparency? How they are changed by the 20th Amendment, and we will analyze the impact of those changes on people in Sri Lanka and then conclusions. The amended Article 153 of the Constitution says that the appointment of an Auditor General is subject to the approval of Constitutional Council. This requirement is now removed by the 20th Amendment, as I have pointed out in red arrows in the picture. This is the 36th of the 19th Amendment. It says that the offices of the President and Prime Minister are under the purview of the Auditor General. Also, the government-owned companies and firms are also covered by the Government Audit Department. But these requirements have been now removed by the Section 40 of the 20th Amendment to the Article 154, as indicated in red arrows below. So in summary, the 20th Amendment proposes to remove the Constitutional Council's approval for the appointment of the Auditor General and make the President all-powerful to appoint the Auditor General in his private choice. And then remove the offices of the President and the Prime Minister from any audit requirement and make them completely mysterious and not transparent. And then it proposes to remove government-owned companies from the purview of Auditor General, and that means they are going to privatize their audits. So in democratic countries, civilized societies, people expect office bearers of public institutions, including cabinet ministers, the Prime Minister, and the President, to utilize public funds efficiently and effectively and not to misuse, not to steal, not even to waste. This public expectation is ensured by two concepts widely known as transparency and accountability. Transparency enables accountability. To achieve transparency in a public firm, it should provide accurate and complete information on time about its transactions and activities and governance to the general public. The credibility of such information is ensured with the integrity and the independency of the auditor. There are two components of accountability. Answerability means providing information, and enforcement means failing to do so. They will be subject to punishment, fines, even imprisonment. The proposers of these repeals complain that these transparency and accountability requirements are not only creating roadblocks and obstacles for them to carry out their business, but also they say it creates a fearful or scary environment for them to make decisions. They say they need an easygoing pitch to play with public funds freely without being watched or more monitored, with no referee, no independent umpire. Therefore, they can play the game without keeping proper accounts and records. By removing the Constitutional Council's approval for appointment of the Auditor General loses his independence. Hence, the credibility of his or her opinion as well. So that the credibility of the information also will also be lost. By removing these transparency and accountability requirements, they expect people to trust them. To to trust people, what we look for is the track record, what we call it Peravaradi. How clean and free from corruption are politicians in Sri Lanka, irrespective of the political parties. Therefore, people may have concerns whether these politicians are trustworthy to hand over a blank check for them to utilize public funds. So, people would be curious to why they cannot be transparent and accountable if they are honest. The situation would create suspicion of integrity and honesty of the office bearers, including politicians. That would damage the reputation of good officers, on the other hand. This easy-going pitch might create harder environment for responsible officials because they are exposed to carry out any order, legitimate or not, from the president or the prime minister. This situation might create very inconducive environments for decision making. This easygoing pitch could make politicians unduly disproportionate, more dangerously powerful and stubborn. And it will provoke to issue orders for unethical or erroneous or even fraudulent activities. This easygoing pitch could motivate errant officers to carry out whatever orders from politicians for personal gratifications or rewards, or they will get punished. So that will make very unpleasant places for honest people to work. There could be additional costs because of the privatizing those government-owned audit of those privatized those companies to get their accounts audited, and there could be some criminal issues because these provisions can or exemptions would provide criminal immunity to the office bearers from the existing criminal laws of the country. So the auditors are the auditors are only watchdogs. Not they are not supposed to catch anybody. Let people know how their funds are used, and therefore these proposed provisions to remove audit function in order to make an easygoing pitch to play with public funds freely without being watched or monitored should be actually defeated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Salier, for your informative presentation. I am delighted to invite our next speaker, well known for her professional human rights record, Professor Deepika Udakama from Sri Lanka. She served as the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka from October 2015 to August 2020. Professor Udakama, a specialist in international human rights law, was Sri Lanka's alternate member to the United Nations Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights. and the UN Subcommission's co-special reporter on globalization and its impact on human rights. Currently, she is chair, professor of law at the University of Peradeniya. We are pleased to have you here and invite you to share your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bopage. Thank you indeed. It's a pleasure to join you. Thank you for the invitation and for organizing this event. Of course, I would say this is a very important civic moment in the life of a country that is experiencing this sort of a turning point where one thinks that the democratic future of the country is headed towards a very perilous journey unless the citizenry stands up and uh, really puts a halt to this very problematic march. I was requested to speak about the 20th Amendment and its impact on human rights protection in Sri Lanka. But before I get to the subject, I think I have to preface my remarks with this observation. When you observe the assessments or review of the 20th Amendment or the analysis of the 20th Amendment in Sri Lanka, many commentators, particularly those who are in favor of the 20th Amendment, seem to analyze it from the point of view of certain personalities. In other words, analysis is personality bound. So and so will not do this, so and so will not do that, the incumbents are like this, etc., etc. And even those who are opposed to it at times engage in this very problematic exercise of relating the amendment to individuals. Constitution of a country is never made having one person or a group of persons in mind. A constitution, as the basic law of the country, has to cater to national needs as basic law for perhaps generations to come, for years to come. But since our constitution has gone through amendments with almost every change of government, we take it very lightly. So I think we should completely eschew this personality-oriented assessment and get to fundamental democratic constitutional principles. After all, when we speak of constitutionalism in a democratic sense, we are not talking about governance under any type of constitution, but we are talking about governance under a just constitution that has embraced fundamental principles of democratic governance. So when I get to the 20th Amendment and look at its possible impact on human rights protection in the country, I think I would like to focus on two of the most fundamental principles of democratic governance. And the first one is that in a democracy, powers that are conferred on elected representatives are not absolute. The powers are essentially conditional. That's the basis on which we forge a social contract. We elect our representatives, confer on them just only a portion of our powers, sovereign powers, and those powers that we confer are conditioned mainly to protect our inherent and inalienable rights, human rights. Call them reserved rights. So these principles, or the one would say it's theory, etc., have to be focused on, otherwise we don't get the practice right either. The second is this whole the principle of checks and balances. That's absolutely of the essence. In fact, the powers conferred on elected representatives are limited by checks and balances. So, for example, one would say, well, a constitution protects the rights very well when you have a good Bill of Rights. I question that. I don't think just by having a very good Bill of Rights, you can guarantee that people's rights are well protected. It's absolutely essential that the entire scheme of the Constitution is geared towards protecting people's rights. And so therefore the checks and balances are essential. So we need a good independent judiciary. We need other bodies such as non-judicial bodies that are being established everywhere in the world. The Human Rights Commission, ombudsman's officers, etc., are absolutely vital to protecting people's rights. So when I look at the 20th Amendment, it's very clear that it goes back to the 78 Constitution, the original form, goes back to the 18th Amendment, this whole model of concentrating power. So this whole idea of conditional, granting of conditional powers is really lost there. Under the draft 20th Amendment, I mean, almost everything is done by the president. All the important appointments are done by the president and unilaterally because the Constitutional Council is removed. A parliamentary council is established, but it can only provide observations to the president. So this involves appointment of Supreme Court justices, the Chief Justice, Court of Appeal justices, all chairs of commissions, the Human Rights Commission, when you speak of human rights protection, of the Election Commission, the Ombudsman of the country, just to mention a few, the Attorney General of the country, the Auditor General, and the list goes on. And then the powers of removal of important office bearers is also there. So, and also the president is immune. The complete immunity is brought back by the 20th Amendment. The 19th Amendment, as we know, made inroads into that immunity by making the presidential actions accountable for fundamental rights violations. That's been removed by the draft 20th Amendment. So this is a recipe that doesn't speak bode very well for human rights protection of the country. I think this quest to assume or to confer on the presidency this level of very strong powers is based on the mistaken assumption that efficient government and strong government requires absolute powers. That is absolutely not true. People cite the previous government and say, look, the 19th Amendment is the one that caused the weakness. And I mean, we know, as those who study constitutions, it's not the 19th Amendment that caused any weakness that was present. It was really the political, the equation and the political differences between the prime minister and the president, the practice of it that really caused this friction that created all the problems. So this idea that efficient government requires absolute powers, harking back to monarchical times, is absolutely objectionable. That is not really borne out by facts around the world. And secondly, the draft 20th Amendment negates checks and balances. As I pointed out earlier, the Constitutional Council is done away with. Under the 19th Amendment, the president could appoint only those who were recommended by the Constitutional Council, which included 3 citizens of repute. That was very important. That was not the best we could get, but in the process of adopting the 19th Amendment, that's the diluted form we got. But one could really, genuinely say, sincerely say, that a consultative process is much better than an individual making all these appointments, and an individual deciding on all these appointments. So if you find, eventually, if the appointments are all made by one person, and we know the political culture of our country, eventually, if these institutions, and it's bound to happen, are weakened and compromised so that people do not have faith in these institutions, where do people go, especially the vulnerable groups, the minorities, the dissidents? Where do they go for protection when their rights are violated? We saw that very clearly at the Human Rights Commission, especially after the April 21st, the Easter Sunday bombings, when the Muslim community in particular was targeted and commonly judged to be the wrongdoer. I think the fact that there was a strong, I would like to think it was a strong commission, that the court was there, courts were there to adjudicate. I think that gave a very sort of reassurances to the public. Now, without those checks and balances, with having only a very weak parliamentary council whose nominated members can be removed by the president when he or she decides to do so, is very problematic. So finally, in conclusion, I think it's very unwise to think that when we are interpreting this mandate that was given by the people, because constantly we hear about the mandate and that the mandate permits reversal of many fundamental principles of constitutional governance or democratic principles of constitutional governance, I think it's unwise to think that people voted their freedoms and rights away in exchange for efficiency and economic development. I doubt it very much. And also the other factor is that fundamental rights or human rights are part of sovereignty, which is inalienable, and no one can interpret this mandate to mean people well said we want development and not our rights. And we still see the legacy of the 19th Amendment in the fact that people are articulating their viewpoints very openly. That was not the case. We know that as human rights advocates, that was not the case before the 19th Amendment. I mean, people were very frightened to speak. Even today, there are those difficulties. But I think people have got used to the idea of expressing their point of view. So I think the best is to call for a new constitution. In fact, today I saw the Ministry of Justice has called for public viewpoints, public proposals for a future constitution of the country. And I think that's the way to go. When in fact the government, this government itself has proposed that a new constitution be adopted, why there should be a stopgap measure of having the 20th Amendment adopted is very questionable. So I think it's important first to consult the people, because the Constitution belongs to the people and to future generations. And the way to move forward is to go for a constitution that is inclusive, that recognizes the pluralism in the country, that recognizes civil and political rights and economic and social rights and cultural rights of the people, so that Sri Lanka can really meet its full potential. It's a country, as we know, full of potential, but has not been able to, really harness that potential because of these undemocratic moves or because of the divisions and the exclusion of groups of people, as we've seen in the past. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Professor Udakama, for your illuminating presentation. Our next speaker is Mr. Senaka Wattegedara. Senaka is a well-known civil society activist and is currently an active member of the International Network of Sri Lankan Diaspora based in Germany. The network's membership is based in Europe. Their focus is on achieving a just and long-lasting political solution to the ethnic question in Sri Lanka, based on the values enshrined in the United Nations Charter of Human Rights. They strongly believe that such a solution needs to be based on devolution of power. Without much ado, let us invite Mr. Senaka Wattegedara to present his views.
සියලු දෙනාටම සුබ සන්ධ්‍යාවක්. මම සේනක වත්තගෙදර දැනට පදිංචි වෙන්නේ ජර්මනියේ. විශේෂයෙන්ම ස්තුතිවන්ත වෙනවා මේ සමුළුව සඳහා මට අදහස් දැක්වීමට අවස්ථාවක් ලබා දීම සම්බන්ධයෙන්. ඒත් එක්ක මම කැමති මේ 20 වෙනි සංශෝධනය ගැනීමත්. ඒ 20 වෙනි සංශෝධනයත් තුළ සිවිල් සමාජය ක්‍රියාකාරීත්වයට ඇතිවන බලපෑම් පිළිබඳ අදහස් කිහිපයක් දක්වන්නට. ඇත්තටම මේ 20 වෙනි සංශෝධනය මගේ තේරුම් ගැනීම හැටියට 20 වෙනි සංශෝධනය කියන්නේ තවත් එක්තරා එක සංශෝධනයක් විතරයි. ලංකාවේ ආණ්ඩුක්‍රම ව්‍යවස්ථා සංශෝධන ක්‍රියාවලිය දිහා බලපුවාම විවිධ අවස්ථාවලදී විවිධ ව්‍යවස්ථා සංශෝධනයන් ගෙනල්ලා තියෙනවා. ඒ ගෙනල්ලා තියෙන සියලුම ව්‍යවස්ථා සංශෝධනයන් ප්‍රමාණවත් ජනතා සහභාගීත්වයකින් සංවාදයකින් තොරව තමයි ගෙනල්ලා තියෙන්නේ. ඒක නිසා ජනතාවගේ පැත්තෙන් ගත්තාම මේ 20 වෙනි සංශෝධනය තවත් එක් ව්‍යවස්ථා සංශෝධනයක් පමණයි කියලා තමයි මගේ අදහස. ඒ කොහොම වුණත් මේම ව්‍යවස්ථා සංශෝධන ක්‍රියාවලිය බලපුවාම ශ්‍රී ලංකා ඉතිහාසයේම ගෙන ආපු ව්‍යවස්ථා සංශෝධන ක්‍රියාවලියන් දිහා බලපුවාම ඒ ව්‍යවස්ථා සංශෝධනයන් ගෙනීමේදී සිවිල් සමාජ තුළට විශාල බරපතල වගකීමක් හැම වෙලාවෙම පැවරලා තියෙනවා. උදාහරණ ඒ පැවරුණු වගකීම් සිවිල් සමාජය විසින් ඇත්තටම ඒවා සිවිල් සමාජය පෞද්ගලිකව ඒවා කරට අරගෙන ජනතාව අතරට ඒවා ගෙන ආපු අවස්ථා පිළිබඳව අපිට ඕන තරම් උදාහරණ දෙන්න පුළුවන්. උදාහරණයක් ඇටියට ව්‍යවස්ථා සංශෝධනය ගෙන ආපු වෙලාවේ සිවිල් සමාජ සංවිධාන විශාල කාර්යභාරයක් කරා. උදාහරණයක් ඇටියට නම් වශයෙන් කියනවා නම් සුනන්ද දේශප්‍රිය වගේ අය, ඒ වගේම ලූෂන් රාජකරුණානායක, එස් මනෝරංජන් එවැනි විශාල පිරිසක් කරදීලා ඒවා ජනතාව අතරට ගෙන යාම සඳහා විශාල කාර්යභාරයක් කළා. ඒත් එක්කම අමතක කරන්නට බෑ ඒ කාලේ වෙනකොට ලංකාවේ සිවිල් සමාජ සංවිධාන ශක්තිමත් සිවිල් සමාජ සංවිධාන කාලයක් රට පුරා තිබුණා. ඒවා බොහෝ වෙලාවට
Now, I am going to provide the brief translation of the presentation made by Mr. Senaka Wattegedara. The presentation is about the potential impact on civil society activities due to the introduction of the 20th Amendment. Thank you very much for the invitation. When we look at the history of constitutional amendments in Sri Lanka, the 20th Amendment is just another amendment introduced by a government in power. I would like to say that the constitutional amendments that have been brought in over the years, they have been brought without adequate public dialogue. Therefore, from the people's point of view, this will also be just another amendment. Hence, the constitutional amendment process has always exerted pressure on civil society, and as a result, they have been pushed to play a major role in the process of enacting constitutional changes. For example, the civil society groups played a major role in the preparations to introduce a new constitution when Chandrika Kumaratunga government was in power. That never eventuated. During that period, there were strong civil and human rights organizations that were interested in human rights and the practice of democracy. But unfortunately, currently, almost all those organizations seem to be either inactive or have become defunct due to demoralization and dissatisfaction. Considering the above circumstances, it is my opinion that people do not have a clear idea about constitutional changes, whether in the form of amendments or as a new constitution. Although civil society organizations have been doing a great deal of work to stabilize human rights and democracy in Sri Lanka for a long time, there is a big question mark over the extent to which they are established in the society at ground level, or whether we are just spinning around in the same place. The Mahinda Rajapaksa government and the racist organizations working against the new constitutional package in the year 2000 by the Chandrika Kumaratunga government were able to create an impression among the people that these concepts of human rights and democracy are concepts coming from the West. This was not only accepted by the people, but they also believe that they need to have an authoritarian ruler. These facts show that there is not enough civil society activism in Sri Lanka to face this challenge. Although various forms of civil action takes place in the country at present, it is not sufficient to challenge the governmental actions such as the 20th Amendment. While it is imperative to oppose the 20th Amendment, I think we also need to pay close attention to the issues currently faced by the civil society in Sri Lanka. Let me give you an example for this. Among civil society organizations, the divisions have become so intense that they have widened to personal levels. I think it will be correct to say that at present, there are no connections established between the civil society organizations in the north and those of the south. In particular, the civil society groups had to face the same adverse consequences when the Yahapalana government, the good governance government, was in power, because those groups worked in tandem with the government in power. Now, from what we know, there will be actions taken by the current government, such as the NGO Suppression Act, which will come into force soon. Anyhow, I do not suggest that the civil society organizations are weak. In the past, they have demonstrated that they could effectively influence people. For example, we could show the strongest role civil society groups played during the 52-day struggle to bring the good governance government into power. Civil society groups, along with some political groups, took the masses to the streets. Anyhow, I do not suggest that the civil society organizations are weak. In the past, they have demonstrated that they could effectively influence people. For example, we could show the strongest role civil society groups played during the 52-day struggle to bring the good governance government into power. Civil society groups, along with some political groups, took the masses to the streets, where Mr. Maithripal Sirisena was just a bubble. Yet, it seems now that the civil society organizations have become weakened due to fragmentation and segmentation among themselves. There are factors that indirectly contribute to this situation. For example, international non-governmental organizations that provide assistance to Sri Lanka. They often select organizations or institutions that can achieve their goals during a very short period of time. Especially organizations that work for long-term goals and with political objectives receive minimum funding from such organizations. I feel this will affect civil society organizations working for rights and democracy in certain ways. I would like to mention that in the process of working towards defeating the laws that are detrimental to human rights and democracy, such as the 20th Amendment, is making civil society organizations a common enemy. Hence, we need to work towards reuniting the civil society organizations and experiment with new ways of reaching out to the youth and political groups. Finally, I need to state that we cannot overcome this challenge without building an independent civil society coalition consisting of conscious and experienced civil society groups in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
අධ්‍යයන කටයුතු ලංකාවේ සිද්ධ වෙනවා රාජ්‍ය සංවිධාන වලට කියලා තොරතුරු එකතු කරනවා ඒක නිසා 20 සංශෝධනයත් එක්කම සම්මුතවන වුණා හෝ ඊට පස්සේ මම හිතන්නේ එවැනි 50 පාර්ලිමේන්තුවට ගෙනීමේ වැඩි ඉඩකඩක් තියෙන බවයි පේන්න තියෙන්නේ මේ නිසා මම අවසාන වශයෙන් කියන්නට උත්සාහ කරන්නේ කිසියම් මේ ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ මානවිකම් මහා ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදය වැනි ඒ වගේම නීති ආධිපත්‍ය අනුව කටයුතු කරන වැඩපිළිවෙලක් ලංකාවේ ස්ථාපනය කිරීමට නම් අපිට විශාල වශයෙන්ම රාජ්‍ය නොවන සංවිධාන පමණක් නෙවෙයි සිවිල් හා දේශපාලන ක්‍රියාකාරී සංවිධාන ශක්තිමත් කරන්නට වෙනවා ඒ අනුව ඒවත් එකට වැඩ කරන්නට වෙනවා ඒ නිසා මගේ පෞද්ගලික අදහස නම් මෙවැනි විශාල අභියෝගයක් එන අවස්ථාවන් වලදී ඒවට මුහුණ දීම සඳහා ෆූල් රාජ්‍ය නොවන සංවිධාන ඒ වගේම දේශපාලන සංවිධාන ඒකාබද්ධ වුණු ශක්තිමත් සිවිල් සංවිධාන ජාලයක් ගොඩනැගීමෙන් තොරව අපිට මේ අවස්ථාව මෙවැනි සංශෝධන වලට එරෙහිව නැගී හිටින්නට ශක්තිමත් නැගී හිටින්නට හැකියාවක් ලැබෙන්නේ නැහැ කියන එකයි මගේ පෞද්ගලික අදහස. කොහොම ස්තුතියි.
Thank you, Mr. Senaka Wattegadara, for your thoughtful presentation. Next, let us invite Dr. Visakesa Chandrasekaram to make his presentation. Dr. Chandrasekaram is a well-known human rights lawyer and community peace worker, better known to us for his independent arts practice in Sri Lanka. He was awarded his doctorate by the Australian National University for his research on the use of confessionary evidence under the counter-terrorism laws in Sri Lanka. He held various positions in the New South Wales government, including in the New South Wales Attorney General's Department. He has authored several creative novels, stage plays, and films on human rights issues. I would like to read you a quote from an interview he did on his film Pangshu and the Price of Memory. He said that as a society, we have agreed to a code of silence regarding both the 1987 to 1990 political violence and the circumstances surrounding the civil war's end in 2009. Now let us call upon him to make his presentation.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for that glowing introduction, and thank you very much indeed for this invitation to be part of this global rally. I'll stick to my notes because I'm not a very good time manager. So I can finish in time. I'm addressing this cyber gathering in the capacity of an artist and academic. I'm also here as a civil rights activist and one of the petitioners who challenged the constitutionality of the proposed 20th Amendment in the Supreme Court. Today, amongst other things, I'm focusing on freedom of expression, without which I cannot function either as an artist or an academic. The essence of my practice is the freedom to express without fear of persecution or arbitrary restrictions. It is also one of the bedrocks of the foundations of our democracy. Friends, I fear that if implemented, this amendment will take our entire nation to the dark ages of 80s, 1980s, which we remember with utmost repugnance. Why do I say so? The proposed amendment is designed clearly to centralize the executive power of the government around the presidency. This amendment will give near unlimited executive powers to the president. The president will appoint the ministers without having to be restricted by a maximum number, and he can remove them at his will. The president will yield power over the independent commission through the proposed parliamentary council. The transparency and accountability of public spending overseen through the procurement commission and the audit commission will disappear. This amendment will also give immense power to the president over the legislature, since he will be able to dissolve the parliament in a year, despite we citizens appoint our representatives for a 5-year term. What is more alarming is the casting of this dark shadow of unlimited executive powers over the judiciary. The president will interfere with the justice system by grabbing power to appoint the attorney general and the police commission. The president will take control of the judiciary by appointing judges to apex courts without the check and balance mechanism which currently exists. Even if the judges dare to hear the cases against the president, no law will allow to bring the president to the court. We have heard many supporters of the current president arguing that in order to save the nation from the chaos similar to what we have experienced in October 2018, we must have a strong office of executive, as pointed out by our colleague here in this, and who will also others also will point out on this matter. They go even further, the supporters of the president will go even further, justifying the need for a majority of 2/3 in the legislature to create such powerful government, which apparently can save us from chaos. But my friends, what is wrong with chaos? That is part of a democracy, and I would even call that is the beauty of the democracy. It may look like chaos, but in fact, that is the extreme end of the dynamism of democracy. That is a price we pay for our freedom, even to the extent to exercise our freedom of expression by taking the streets. Rejecting the demands for a powerful king-like president who would establish order, I argue that quite opposite will come through the proposed amendment. Without a doubt, this amendment will create a despotic office for the executive under whose authority this nation will plunge into further chaos of corruption, nepotism, lawlessness, and utter disregard to basic human values. How will that happen? Now let me briefly remind you the dark ages of 80s. Our first president, executive president, President Jayawardena, ran this country for nearly 12 years with very similar powers which have been now attempted to accumulate by the current president through the proposed amendment. What's more, Jayawardena regime had more than 2/3 majority in the parliament. With that power, Jayawardena government took us down to the deep agony of a youth uprising in the south and a separatist civil war in the north, which was handed down to 4 more successive presidents. The entire regime of Jayawardena was spotted with numerous attacks against individual civilians, including artists and activists, and the reign was blemished with suppression of organized opposition by attacking unions, student campaigns, and independent media. All that was done in the name of a powerful government which claimed to have brought the material development through its economic reforms. Part of this saga was somewhat similarly reenacted during the time of other presidents, including Mahinda Rajapaksa. Yes, I don't deny some development came through post-1978 constitutional reforms, but with those massive dams and freeways built by allegedly allocating huge commissions to be pocketed by middle persons, we have inherited billions of debts. Friends, it is a massively failed system, and there is no new justification to experiment on it again. The proposed amendment is clearly undemocratic. It has been argued and will be argued further by my fellow speakers that the proposed amendment will attack the very democratic foundation of our Constitution by undermining separation of power. It will limit our right to invoke the fundamental rights jurisdiction of the Supreme Court by creating two classes of citizens, those who are subject to law and those who have the immunity from the law. The holiest principles of our democracy, the rule of law, will be broken. How this is going to have an impact on our freedom of expression? Without democracy, we won't have freedom to express, because an autocracy is built on the very solid foundation of preserving the power of the person who is holding it. It does not tolerate dissent. It suppresses all expressions which would even marginally shake its foundation. If this amendment gets through the parliament, the history will repeat. There will be attacks on media, there will be abductions of activists, there will be banning of movies, and the list will continue. As we have seen under the previous regimes, there will be goons and thugs in white or blue collar with pens or clubs will roam freely under the proxy of the powerful presidents, whom will be feared by artists, activists, unionists, students, clergy, parliamentarians, and even the judges. We don't want a despot to be feared for. We want a democratic leadership who would share the same right as us and who is not above the law. It is all our responsibility to preserve the democratic institutions for the future generations to enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chandrasekaran, for your instructive thoughts. Our next speaker is Mr. Anthony Gratian from Melbourne, Australia. Mr. Gratian is an activist within the Victorian Sri Lankan community, well known for his contributions to make collective community activities in Melbourne successful. He is founder member and current secretary of the Australian Advocacy for Good Governance in Sri Lanka and former president director of the Australian Tamil Congress Victoria chapter. Anthony is a former producer presenter on Melbourne 3CR radio on matters of socio-political oppression, community welfare, and human rights. Currently, he serves as a volunteer with St. Vincent de Paul Society. He continues to give voice for democracy, justice, and equality in Sri Lanka. Let us warmly welcome Anthony for his presentation.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. First of all, let me thank you all for coming together virtually from across the world to demand a governance system for Sri Lanka that respects democracy and values the opinions and feelings of its peoples. Tonight, I speak on behalf of Australian Advocacy for Good Governance in Sri Lanka, an advocacy organization for good governance in Sri Lanka. We work with similar organizations as a collective to help Sri Lanka change for the better. In a parliamentary democracy, a government is subject to the judgment of the electors at periodical general elections, with the cabinet being the principal policy and decision-making body of the government. But if the country's head of state were to have the powers to influence or override such collective decisions, it will seriously undermine the will of the people. Collaboration between the centre and the regional administrations is so essential for real and sustainable development. If a single person of authority can overrule all such decisions, chaos and confusion will reign. Tensions between tiers of government will become inevitable and people's aspirations cannot be fulfilled. Citizens should have the right to reject what is inappropriate culturally and socially. And if that freedom of choice is curbed with narrow socio-political goals, Economic prosperity cannot be sustained. Arguments over jurisdiction and central government high-handedness will become all too common. The only benefactors will be those who abuse power and enrich themselves behind the veil of accelerated development. Devolving decision-making is so important. No amount of money and authority will succeed if the local residents oppose a project or feel threatened by it. Everything will come to naught. But if the people have their say on a project from its planning stage, they will feel part of it, take ownership for its success, and do everything to sustain it. On the other hand, unilateralism will tear communities apart and hinder progress. All good governments will respect their most basic constitutional responsibility, that is, to seek the consent of the governed. Ramming through reforms with little or no consultation will be very harmful. The proposed 20th Amendment to the Constitution Bill seeks to entrench the power of one person and inhibits the government benefiting from active public participation. I would like to quote Pierre Andrews, a renowned data and digital government specialist from Australia, who has written extensively on how to better public sectors. You have a better chance of your work being successful by bringing in the experience, expertise, and natural motivations of the communities you serve. Getting diverse voices in the room means your work will naturally be more inclusively designed and more likely to help more people. User-centered practices. When you engage with the end users of your work, be it a service or policy, you have a better chance of meeting their actual needs. Participatory drafting. This is where something is still in an early formative phase and you engage publicly in helping shape it from the start. Independence. When public policy is informed from a genuinely a political professional perspective, that is, genuinely a political professional perspective, you get more evidence-based policies. So some political independence is crucial to genuine participatory public governance. Shared oversight. The highest level of participatory public governance is where you have public transparency, oversight and participation in the ongoing governance of your work. Sometimes this is ostensibly achieved through independent advisory or steering groups. It is good to recall here the Buddha's words of wisdom. Greed, hatred, delusion, not paying proper attention, and wrongly directed thoughts are the reasons of committing an evil deed. Constructively engaging, on the other hand, with due respect will produce much better outcomes for the people than shoving unilateral decisions down their throat. For example, in the current COVID-19 situation, the virus is surging in many parts of Europe and governments are struggling to cope. COVID-19 has proved that overly centralized and surreptitiously politicized actions don't work. If not for the participatory government system, even these most advanced countries would have not been able to achieve whatever progress they had been able to achieve. So fear not to be participatory for the good of the people. Fear not to be inclusive. Inclusiveness is a key requirement for prosperity, especially in a multi-ethnic and multi-religious society like ours. We earnestly appeal to all parliamentarians of Sri Lanka to consider the repercussive effects a non-participatory governance could have on the very people who put you in power. Be awake. Let not Sri Lanka bleed from within. May wisdom prevail and love and understanding win. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for your informative thoughts. Now, we are playing a video interlude.
இலங்கை என்பது நம் தாய் திருநாடு, எழில் மிகுந்த இயற்கை வளமும் நிறைந்த நல் நாடு. மாணிக்க முத்துகளும் மாண்புறு காட்சிகளும் மனதை கவர்ந்திடும் நாடு. மாணிக்க முத்துகளும் மாண்புறு காட்சிகளும் மனதை கவர்ந்திடும் நாடு. நுவரெலியா பகவந்தலா கண்டிகம்பளை, தேயிலையாய் பொன் விளையும் பூம்பொழி சோலை, சிவனொளி பாதமலை தலதா மாளிகையும் தெரிந்திடும் மாமலை நாட்டில். சிவனொளி பாதமலை தலதா மாளிகையும் தெரிந்திடும் மாமலை நாட்டில். யாழ்ப்பாணம் என்று சொன்னால் தேன் சுவை ஊறும், பனை வளமும் புகையிலையும் ஒன்றாக வளரும். கந்தனின் நல்லூர் கண்டு கடல் வளம் நிறைய உண்டு, கலைவளம் பெருகுது அங்கு. கந்தனின் நல்லூர் கண்டு கடல் வளம் நிறைய உண்டு, கலைவளம் பெருகுது அங்கு.
இலங்கை என்பது நம் தாய் திருநாடு, 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 இலங்கை என்பது நம் தாய் திருநாடு.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for your contribution to that interlude. Our next speaker is Mr. Viswalingam Sivalingam, a well-known friend and a comrade from London. He is a former member of the Communist Party of Sri Lanka and has been a leading writer and columnist and Tamil community activist since 1972. Mr. Sivalingam was involved in refugee settlements in the UK since the 1980s and radio broadcasting since 1990. Being a graduate in political science, he continues to contribute to numerous discussions and research papers on democracy and human rights in many forums. It is our pleasure to invite Mr. Sivalingam to present his thoughts.
Thank you again, the chairperson, distinguished guest, and the organizers of Voice of Democracy. I thank you for this opportunity to participate in this online protest rally in the name of Defend Democracy in Sri Lanka. I believe that the deliberations of governments will be reflected in the people's perception, and once molded, it's exceedingly difficult to reverse it. Sri Lanka has gone through desecrating parliamentary democracy, constitutional skullduggery, conflicts of war against its own citizens, military interference in the civil administration, contravention of UN undertakings, and the collisions of extreme Buddhist intolerance ideology in the system. The resultant manifestation of warmongering, majoritarian nationalism, the threat of Islamic terrorism alien to Muslims, and the ongoing mood of tribalism lured the majority to perpetuate an authoritarian rule. Securing the two-thirds majority by intimating and intimidating MPs is expected to continue. The group of politicians promised to eradicate corruption and strengthen democracy are also succumbed to ongoing systematic corrupt practices and officiated their own exit from the parliament. The worrying part is the failure of security apparatus, reflected in the commission, is also used as a political maneuver. Fear-mongering is a tool to make people to vote by hook or crook. Parliamentary norms were violated, encouraged crossovers, and changed the constitution for their own advantage. The fundamental principle of sovereignty was violated, as well as a social contract between the legislature and the citizens. The above practices identified the shortcomings of democracy due to the conflict interest displayed explicitly instead of both power centers complementing each other. The parliamentary system of governance functions under certain principles like delegation of sovereignty, constitutional governance, the separation of powers, accountability, and the rule of law, but nothing has permeated firmly within the society. Our parliamentary governance also shows how major parties failed to resolve national question during the constitution making process. In 1972, While Tamil leaders requested to change the basic nature of the constitution to be federal, Srimao Bandaranaike introduced unitary concept inspired. In 1978, UNB openly declared injustices inflicted on Tamils, and the UNB government procured 5/6 majority but failed to resolve through roundtable conference as pledged in the manifesto. In both instances, the constitutions were adopted without the participation of disgruntled Tamils. ICJ made an important legal observation in 1983 that the Tamils have withheld their sovereignty from the Sri Lanka. The repetition of violation in constitution making cannot be continued in Sri Lanka. The ongoing trajectory of constitution making after the adoption of 20th Amendment will pave the way for the um, dissolution of plurinational political solution, and one nation dream is expected to be forsaken for ethnocentric agenda. The argument to undermine the parliament process is the recipe to destroy democratic governance. Democracy maintains equilibrium via checks and balances of competing institutions. Only a sadist can bolster a strong executive to the conditions of developing countries like ours without checks and balances. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Here are the excerpts from first executive president JR himself. Such an executive is a strong executive seated in power for a fixed number of years, not subject to whims and fancies of an elected legislature, not afraid to take correct but unpopular decisions because of censor from parliamentary parties. This is the predicament we face today. President is ready to ignore whims and fancies of parliament via 20A. During the introduction of Second Republican Constitution, many parliamentarians opposed to. Colvin de Silva argued that the executive power is vested in a president directly elected by the people, cannot undermine the parliament, but JR wants government immune from public pressure.
It's 3 minutes
Colvin,
more.
Colvin also said that it would result in two powers at the apex of the state counterpoise each other, but each drawing power from the same source. Even the UNB Minister ACS Hamid argued that pulling powers from parliament is a robbery. Whoever holds the reins of office must be sensitive to public opinion, and system by which whole country elects the president can be harmful to the minority. The present idea of totalitarian regime draws its authority from Kajaba regiment, Buddhist chapters, and also technocracy, autocracy, and oligarchy constituents of ruling elites. When we observe this crisis, it should also be viewed through the prevailing economic system. Executive presidency allowed the state-controlled economy to the market system as a neoliberal economic system. Policy objectives focused to make a conducive environment for foreign investors at the expense of the toiling masses. The introduction of market economy is the first step to ignore welfare of the citizens and alienate the sovereign power of its people. But today, our rulers not bothered on democratic fundamentals because they have lowered the bar of standard of human security low enough to profit from their monetary advantages. Sri Lanka is under the yoke of autocracy already. Why they need 20A? Who is behind to push this new agenda? Why brothers are unable to cohabit under prevailing conditions? Is a chronic capitalist class dreaming to form autocratic rule via democratic means to juxtapose with Chinese geopolitical interests?
Only 1 minute more.
The observation is that today's tendencies may tilt the balance towards presidential executive at any cost. I believe that for to instigate this kind of chintanayas with the idea of ethnically exclusivist and hegemonic project, and instead of amalgamating the centrifugal act of power devolvement and the centrifugal act of united responsibility in a plurinational nation state. The present regime insists on a special place not only to Buddhism, but also Buddhist Sangha, monasteries, institutions incorporated into foremost place in the singular nation to undermine the other nations without nation state. Evolving constitutional endeavors reminding me of neo Hitler in the making. In summary, Sri Lanka is facing democratic deficit due to its inability to adapt plurinational democracy for multi-ethnic polity. The growing tendency towards geopolitical confrontation. 40 years of economic development based on neo-economic policies failed to invest in the peace, social capital, and human security. The imposition of hegemonic subjugation of minorities, military occupation, and withholding accountability in its deliberations. Instead of devolving power to the periphery, the executive opt for the concentration of power and denial of true sovereignty. Finally, I conclude the debates today on executive presidency and execution of democracy should be challenged widely for the best interest of all. Many thanks, and let's work to strengthen democracy of our beloved country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Sivalingam, for your revealing presentation. Our next speaker is a well-known Dr. Amir Ali, a Sri Lankan-born Australian living in Perth. Dr. Ali was educated at the University of Ceylon, the London School of Economics, and received his doctorate in economics from the University of Western Australia. Later, he was a lecturer at the University of Ceylon, Murdoch University, the University of Brunei, and the University of Western Australia. He was formerly president of the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils, an umbrella group for various Islamic groups in Australia, and former chair of the Australian Muslim Community Reference Group, an advisory body to the federal government. He has authored over 80 scholarly publications on matters of public importance. Let us warmly welcome Dr. Ali to make his presentation.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this. Without further ado, I'll get right into this topic. Sri Lanka has reached a critical juncture. What is going to happen the next few days with regard to 20A is going to decide whether we will preserve and continue to preserve the legacy of democracy that we cherished for the last 70 years, or we are going to turn towards autocracy. From the beginning of this presidency of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, he felt that he didn't have enough power to satisfy the demands of those who backed him. And of those who backed him, one of the most damaging group I call them as Buddhist supremacists. They want to destroy, or they hate the plural democracy of Sri Lanka. Pluralism has been managed so successfully by the ancient monarchs and also the others until now. In fact, Sri Lanka holds an envious record of successfully managing a plural society at least in the Asian region. Now that management is going to be jeopardized by the 20A, which is going to bestow powers on this president who wants to, whose backers want to homogenize this country and who want to devalue the value of pluralism, which is going to affect minorities. From the beginning, there have been sentiments expressed by the hardliners. Sri Lanka, only the Buddhists are the owners of Sri Lanka, others are resident aliens. What does that mean? They are encouraging, by saying that, they are encouraging these minorities to become the fifth colonists or to become not to be patriotic. This is the most damaging effect of what's going to happen over the next few years. It's a family rule. It's a rule by the hardliners and also the capitalists or the Buddhist capitalists. They want to own everything. They want to dominate politics. They want to own the economy, and they want to homogenize this country. The slogans have been expressed very often. That is, Sri Lanka should be ruled by one law, one country. That slogan. What does that mean? Whose law is that? Now, this has not been analyzed. So I think what we had to do is to fight tooth and nail to see that this 20A is defeated. Now, furthermore, of the two minorities, this is where my own community comes to picture. The last 10 or 20, since 2009, the Muslim community has been at the receiving end of elements that want to send them back to somewhere. And they said in several places that the Muslims had to be molded in the ethos of what they think is Buddhism. This is a country that has a wonderful golden history. Their communities lived together and they shared the values, and the country prospered. The moment this is destroyed, as is going to happen after the 20th Amendment, and we are going to see the destruction of this country. Unfortunately, for this government, the coronavirus has come in. That coronavirus is, as far as we are concerned, is a blessing in disguise, because this coronavirus has damaged the economy so much that this country cannot be built up without the unity and cooperation of the minorities. From the beginning, Gotabaya Rajapaksa has been saying that there's no sharing of power with the Tamils, but the only solution is economic development. He need to realize that once development takes place, the next fight will be for rights and liberties. This has been the history throughout the world, which he doesn't seem to know. In conclusion, what I want to say is that this is a very critical period, and the minority communities in their own interest must fight tooth and nail to see that it's defeated. Already we see that there are cracks in the fortress. And Venerable the prelates, three prominent prelates have come out openly and written to the president that this should be stopped at once. If it continues, the country is going to be in jeopardy, and at a time when there are so many other forces, foreign forces, are trying to compete to come into this country, the country's sovereignty itself is in jeopardy. Finally, once again, I thank you very much to express my sentiments. I feel really disgusted because this is a wonderful country with fertile country. It has been prospered previously, and we cannot allow that to be destroyed by the silly 2020A. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Amir Ali, for your instructive presentation. Now it is our turn to invite the well-known Dr. Jayampati Vikramaratne, Attorney at Law and President's Counsel. Dr. Vikramaratne was a Member of Parliament from September 2015 to January 2020 and was a member of the Steering Committee of the Constitutional Assembly. He was a member of the Drafting Committee of the Constitution Bill of 2000 and played a key role in the drafting of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. He is a founder director of the Institute for Constitutional Studies. His first doctorate was from the University of Peradeniya for his thesis, Fundamental Rights in Sri Lanka. The second is from the University of Colombo for his published work, Towards Democratic Governance in Sri Lanka, a Constitutional Miscellany. He is presently a guest researcher at the University of Freiburg, Switzerland. Over to Dr. Jayampati Vikramaratne.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Friends and comrades, I will focus on the impact of the 20th Amendment on Parliament, which is the institution that exercises the people's legislative power. And therefore, I argue that it impinges on the sovereignty of the people. The executive administers laws that Parliament makes. Executive does not and cannot make law. At least in Sri Lanka, the executive cannot rule by decree. The big mistake that the 1978 constitution made was to place Parliament in a position superior to, rather to place the president in a position superior to the Parliament. But even under the 1978 constitution, under Article 42, it is the cabinet of ministers that is charged with the direction and control of the government of the republic, not the president. And apart from the president who heads the cabinet, all the other members of the cabinet are members of parliament. So you would see that parliament has a role even in the executive. Parliament also has other important functions. It is parliament that controls public finance. Parliament also has a very important oversight function. There are so many committees, and it oversees the way, through working through these committees, it oversees the way in which the administration, the executive acts, how the administration works. And for a country like ours, a multicultural society like ours, parliament is very important, because while the president rather acts on his own, parliament is a collegial decision-making body. It discusses, debates, and arrives at decisions, not the president. He works on his own from the presidential secretariat. Now, the 19th Amendment strengthened parliament, especially in relation to the president. And most importantly, his power to dissolve parliament was severely restricted. Now, the 20th Amendment seeks to give almost unlimited powers back to the president to dissolve parliament. The government now says that it will bring a committee stage amendment to say that, to provide that the president can dissolve parliament only after 2.5 years. Still, even after 2.5 years, the president will be able to arbitrarily dissolve a properly functioning parliament. A properly functioning parliament with a prime minister leading a stable government. Why should the president be given that power? Why should the president be empowered to dissolve parliament which is functioning properly with a stable government? In the United Kingdom, parliament can be under the Fixed Term Parliament Act. Parliament can be dissolved during the first 4.5 years only if a 2/3 majority requests. But there is another important provision which has been lost sight of. Parliament must be dissolved when a government is defeated through a no confidence motion, and a new government does not win a trust vote within 14 days. So when it is obvious that no stable government can be formed, Parliament must be dissolved. Now, why cannot the government offer to put in a provision like that? I don't think anybody will object. If a stable government cannot be formed, then of course there is a case for dissolving parliament. But what is sought to be done is to give unlimited power to the president, even after 2.5 years, to dissolve parliament arbitrarily, dissolve a properly functioning parliament arbitrarily. Now about the prime minister. My point is that the real leader of parliament is the prime minister, not the speaker. The speaker is only the formal head of parliament, formal head who presides over parliament. But it is the prime minister who is actually, in the order of precedence, he ranks above the speaker, after the president, because he is the person who parliament has chosen to be prime minister. So he is the real leader of parliament. No, but unfortunately, the 1978 constitution empowered the president to remove the prime minister at any time. And we were able to change this in the 19th Amendment, remedy this, to say that parliament can remove the prime minister only by way of a no confidence motion or defeating the budget or the statement of government policy. So on the floor of the House, if Parliament defeats the Prime Minister, then automatically he goes out. This strengthened Parliament and therefore also strengthened the sovereignty of the people. Now the 20th Amendment seeks again to empower the President to dismiss the Prime Minister at any time and also to take away his present right to nominate ministers. Today, President can appoint ministers only if they are nominated by the Prime Minister. So now, why should the President be given the power, I question, to dismiss a Prime Minister who enjoys the confidence of Parliament? There is no rationality in this thing. And of course, it has been said that even if the Prime Minister is removed and a new Prime Minister is appointed, the new Prime Minister can be defeated in Parliament. But why leave room for all this uncertainty? Why give the President an opportunity to manipulate? We saw this, we have seen this in October 2018, how President Sirisena tried to entice members of Parliament to cross over and support Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa, whom he appointed as Prime Minister, having removed Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe. Fortunately, he did not succeed. Now, also, the President, under our Constitution, the President cannot appoint any member of Parliament. He has no discretion. He is, of course, the appointing authority, but he has no discretion. He has no discretion. He has to appoint the member of Parliament who is most likely to command the confidence of Parliament. He has to appoint the MP who is most likely to command the confidence of Parliament. And there, my point is, there can be only one such MP. The singular version of the Constitution makes it very clear. Very clear. පාර්ලිමේන්තුවේ උපරිම වශයෙන් පාර්ලිමේන්තුවේ විශ්වාසය උපරිම වශයෙන් ඇති පාර්ලිමේන්තු මන්ත්‍රීවරයා. So it is, the President cannot appoint anybody. There are only one person he can appoint, and that is the person who is most likely to command the confidence of Parliament. Then, why should the President be given the power to remove such a Prime Minister just because he is the appointing authority? Some people argue, well, you can go to court. But why leave it to court? By the time the court decides, the political manipulation would have taken place. Offering of portfolios, money changing hands would have done the damage. And this nearly happened in 2018. So the power to remove the Prime Minister permits the President to manipulate and to negate the will of the people expressed at the previous parliamentary election. Now these two together, the power of dissolution and the power to remove the Prime Minister at will, is dangerous. And it has the potential to destabilize society. But changes are now being made, claiming that it is to ensure stability. And in this regard, I want to conclude by quoting Colbinard de Silva. When during the making of the 1978 Constitution, Mr. Jayawardena proposed a presidential system to ensure stability, and we must not forget that even Mr. Dudley Senanayak opposed it. Only Mr. Premadasa seconded Mr. Jayawardena's proposal. The entire UNP was against it, and even Mr. Hamid spoke in the Constituent Assembly against the proposal, and Mr. Dudley Senanayak made it very clear that what had succeeded, at least partly, in the United States and France cannot succeed in Sri Lanka. He says the presidential system is in third world countries for Nasser of Egypt and Nkrumah of Ghana, but not for our countries. Colvin, responding to this proposal, said, I am very anxious to make this clear. And this is an effort, he said. He said, this word stability covers a multitude of wrong propositions. He said, I can imagine him saying this. He said, stability. What kind of stability are we talking of? A stability that comes from the withdrawal of the central power from the influence of the masses, Colvin questioned. Similarly, today, we have an argument that you need stability, that the president has to be given the power to destabilize parliament for the sake of stability. So my argument is that the 20th Amendment permits the president to make a mockery of parliament, to destabilize parliament, to make a mockery of parliament, to remove a prime minister who has the confidence of parliament, who is the effective leader of parliament, and even to dissolve parliament. When parliament is performing well, there is a stable parliament, there is a stable government with a prime minister who commands the confidence of parliament. And therefore, I argue that 20th Amendment therefore interferes, or rather it weakens the sovereignty of the people and should not be allowed to be passed. And I hope there will be 75 members of parliament who will have the courage to vote against, or even at least not to vote for the 20th Amendment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vikramaratne, for the informative and illuminating presentation. Our next invitation is to Ms. Srin Saru from Sri Lanka. She is a founder of the Mana Women's Development Federation and a source of courage for victims of state violence and those who work for equality, reconciliation, and respect for human rights. Ms. Saru is creating a new cadre of young women working towards overcoming the socio-cultural inequalities that have long prevented women from exercising their rights as citizens. Ms. Saru was elected to the Ashoka Fellowship in 2017. She won the Franco-German Prize for Human Rights and the Rule of Law in 2017, the Voices of Courage Award, and the 5th International Bremen Peace Award. She is also a writer on human rights, social justice, and politics. It is our pleasure to invite Ms. Saru to make her presentation.
Lionel and everybody, thank you very much. I'm not going to waste my time, and I'm also not a constitutional expert, but I'll try to see what I can do. So one of the good things, everybody is talking about bad things, but one of the good things that just happened for you all to understand what independent judiciary means is that 39 FR application went in. That also because we had 15 days, the 2 period, and also 7 days of order within that period. Out of that, at least 4 clauses, clause number 3, 5, 14, and 22, the Supreme Court said referendum, which is also important to a certain extent for us to understand what to 2018 when the constitutional coup happened, how the independent judiciary, Supreme Court, reinstated democracy in Sri Lanka. So what we are going to lose in the 20th Amendment is that independent judiciary. We have to understand that, right? Many of the victims that I have been working with in the past, particularly the Tamil women and also the Muslim women in the recent past, for us to demand justice. And having said that, we have been door knocking. Certain cases, like if you take the Vishwamadhu rape case, it took almost 6 years for us to ask for a judgment. That's 5 military officers raped a Tamil women. Now, what happened in the appeal court is appeal court dismissed. So these 6 years of this victim struggle, an appeal can dismiss. The problem we have to see very carefully, but is no other than Gotabaya Rajapaksa appoints appeal court judges, Supreme Court judges. What will happen to all this work that we have done in the past, bringing victims to court? Now, if you take transitional justice processes that we have started, and everybody is blaming us for 2/3 because we started process. Process the people who want transitional justice in Sri Lanka, many of them are victims. We have two mechanisms, that is Office of Missing Person and reparation. I'm not telling all of the people who are affected are happy about it, but we have made recognition in Sri Lanka that disappearance did happen. People got affected, right? So these mechanisms can vanish if Gotabaya Rajapaksa gets 20th Amendment done, because these mechanisms will become dormant. I'm also going to talk about something that is happening currently. Ever since this president got elected, it's almost a year. And the militarization of the civil service, militarization of the health service, and militarization of the Eastern Province. Now, the president has been appointing task force. He has appointed 3 task force. Most of them are military men, Buddhist monks. Now, if you take the Eastern Province Task Force on heritage, it is military men and Buddhist monks, right? Where are the minorities? Now, this president, having this mandate of 20th Amendment, he will continue to appoint task force. What the task force is right now doing is purely how the ethnic conflict started in this country, changing the demography of the Eastern Province. There is singular colonization right now happening in the name of heritage, right? So this president getting all this power and appointing governors, right now he has appointed a singular governor to Eastern Province. So what is happening to 13th Amendment? It's a piecemeal repealing of 13th Amendment, because one and only thing the Tamil community has got is devolution of power through 13th Amendment. President with concentration of power and his power to go into governors is going to undermine the electoral power that the minority communities have given in the province, the local authority and the provincial council, because the president will give that power to the governors to do whatever they want. And he's appointing task force constitutionally. But for us to challenge him, it's going to be very difficult if he goes with the 20th Amendment and get that power that he needs. Then I'm also going to talk about the urgent bill. Now in Sri Lanka, 178 urgent bills have been passed since 1978 to 2011. Urgent bill means the president just can inform the Supreme Court within 72 hours. Supreme Court gives a decision whether the bill can be passed or not. Now, even in Sri Lanka, Motor Traffic Act, even Parliament Pension Act got passed as urgent bill. Now, in the last 19th Amendment period, there was a Counter-Terrorism Act that we challenged. When the draft was there, we had time to go and challenge those Counter-Terrorism Act, because it's not only about terrorism, it's curbing dissent in the country. And the citizens had the time and the avenue, the court, independent court, to go and complain. Worst case scenario, we went to Human Rights Commission and complained and got a 30 days binding so that we can do the fundamental rights application later, right? But now that window is going to be closed, right? So with regard to urgent bill, now right now, Rajapaksas have put Counter-Terrorism Act and the Voluntary Service Organization Act, which will curb every possible civil society organization functioning in Sri Lanka pretty soon. If the urgent action bill thing get passed in the 20th Amendment, what will happen is all the laws president can pass without any consultation whatsoever with the citizens of the country within 72 hours of consulting his own Supreme Court judges. I will leave it with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Saru, for your interesting and inspiring presentation. Our next speaker is Mr. Asela Jayanath Dimel from Sydney, Australia. Mr. Dimel is a graduate of the Kelaniya University in Sri Lanka and holds a master's degree from the University of Western Sydney and a master's honours degree from the University of New England. He has been a political activist since 1981 and became the first president of the Students' Federation of the Sri Lanka Mahajana Party in 1984. Later, he was elected a vice president of the Sri Lanka Mahajana Party, but left it in 2004 due to policy disputes. He also worked as an editor of the newspaper Dinakara and a director, News and Current Affairs of the Sri Lanka Rupawahini Corporation. Currently, he is a teacher, journalist, research officer, case manager, and an author. Let us call upon Mr. Demel to make his presentation.
Dear comrades, good morning, afternoon, or evening. The government led by Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa is about to introduce a new amendment to the Constitution of Sri Lanka. The concept of democracy has evolved along a long way, and it has always had proponents and opponents. When the camp of proponents wins the floor, democracy blossoms, but it shrinks when its opponents have the say. Unfortunately, people who have less regard for democracy have won the floor in Sri Lanka by attracting a majority of votes in the elections held recently. They apparently believe that an authoritarian ruler can find remedies for most ailments that the Sri Lankan society has been suffering from since the time of independence. As democracy-loving, responsible global citizens, we certainly have to oppose this regressive move. As Lord Acton once correctly said in a letter addressed to the Pope, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Dear comrades, today my aim is not to focus on the entire amendment, but to draw your attention to a particular feature detectable in the proposed amendment. You may recall the progressive 19th Amendment, which introduced many changes to strengthen the democratic system in the country, even though the Yahapalana government lacked the innovation to prepare the background for people to feel the value of those democratic reforms and failed to market it. Even though the 19th Amendment is commended as a progressive legal document, it does not mean that it was perfect. It has many deficiencies. The most significant deficiency was the lack of a clear and a consistent vision or a philosophy behind it. It was merely a legal document made only by focusing on legal aspect of the Constitution. It is not organic but mechanical. The value of the 19th Amendment sharply dropped with the introduction of the laws to deprive Sri Lankan dual citizens of some of their civil rights. An amendment aimed at establishing a system to protect all citizens' basic rights has arbitrarily and unnecessarily deprived some citizens of the country of their some civil rights. It created a new problem which has hitherto absent. Instead of reducing the problems, it has added a new one. After the introduction of the 19th Amendment, some Sri Lankans lost the opportunity they hitherto had to contest the presidential and parliamentary elections if they have citizenship of other countries. Architects of the amendment put a blob of cow feces to the pot of milk filled by themselves. Ironically, the proposed 20th Amendment is going to rectify this serious mistake made by the people belonging to pro-democracy camp. Despite the fact that such a rectification is inconsistent with their ideology, people with less regard for a system based on equity and equality are going to rectify it, while we, the people of the other camp with high regard for democracy, apparently see dual citizens as aliens guilty of committing serious crimes punishable for by depriving some of their civil rights. Dear comrades, our politicians apparently believe that the contemporary world political map consists of nearly 200 independent states. Mostly nation state is perennial and it is as old as Earth. According to this belief, this map is a creation of God or nature. It was there at the time of the formation of Earth some 4.5 billion years ago, and the boundaries between those states had been demarcated along national lines at that time, depicting a picture exactly similar to the current one. None of them understand that the oldest nation state on this map is not older than 250 years. The progressive 19th Amendment lost the consistency as a result of failing to understand that national boundaries are important, but they become detrimental if they are so rigid. For our politicians, national boundaries are perennial and sacred. They are permanent and non-negotiable. Nobody has moral rights to love another country. Citizens' affections must stop sharply at the gateway between our country and their country. whoever tends to love another country must be punished. One person can love only one country. What a natural law. During the peak of nationalist era, most thinkers with compassion for humanity saw nationalism as a toxic doctrine produced by capitalist development for a temporary necessity. They hardly saw any importance or permanency in this doctrine. Marx, Engels, Lenin and Trotsky, all of those great internationalists, despised nationalist politics. Rosa Luxemburg, or revolutionary Red Rosa, refused to support the national liberation struggle of her own country upon the ground that national consciousness undermines the unity of working people, the proletariat. Leo Tolstoy, the greatest novelist of the world for many literary critics, once said that nationalism is the site of execution. What it practices is the art of killing. What it discusses is the ways of killing. It has nothing to do with the real life of the masses. Dear comrades, why did the Yahapalana government insert this exclusivist clause to the 19th Amendment? We were able to hear a number of theories in this regard on those days. One theory said that the government had the intention of preventing some members of Rajapaksa family from entering politics. If this is true, isn't this dirty politics? If someone wants to stop someone in politics, do it politically. The Yahapalana government gave many reasons to justify what they did. Their main argument was based on the conflict of interest theory. As they argued, a politician can face a dilemma when there is a warlike situation between two nations if she or he got citizenship in both warring countries. Recently, I heard a senior parliamentarian of the Samagi Janabalawegaya, who was also a state minister of the Yahapalana government, was asking what side a member of Sri Lankan parliament with citizenship of Sri Lanka and Australia can take if there is a war between these two countries. The senior parliamentarian must first understand that there is a higher possibility for a war between Sri Lanka and the planet Mars than an armed conflict between Sri Lanka and Australia. Nevertheless, let's imagine for a while that there is an actual war between these two countries. In such a situation, what could a Sri Lankan parliamentarian do if she or he got Australian citizenship as well? Aren't there any option for this politician if she or he is loyal to both the countries? What are the ways to avoid conflict of interest in such situation? There are many. The first is conscience. Let that politician decide what she or he is doing is morally right or wrong. If she or he sees justice on one side, let her or him take that side. The second option is neutrality. If that politician is against any types of war, let her or him take a neutral stand. The third option is more common. Persons in higher positions must have the courage and integrity to step down. When the conflict of interest prevents them from taking correct decisions, that's what responsible judges do in this world. Conflict of interest can arise anywhere and for anybody. It is not an issue peculiar to politicians with dual or multiple citizenships. The civilized world has many more ways to avoid conflict of interest. Dear comrades, you may agree with me that this particular clause of the 19th Amendment contradicts a number of articles included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This unfair law is directly contradictory with the Articles 1, 2, 7, 21 and 29 of the Declaration, because some citizens of the country have become second-class citizens as a result of introducing this law. It is true that the proposed 20th Amendment will rectify this mistake, but should we support it because of this single rectification? I say certainly no. Because of this one and only progressive change, we cannot support the entire amendment consist of so many regressive changes. If we weigh the pros and cons of this amendment by putting them into two sides of a scale, the side of cons is very heavy, heavier than tolerable and bearable extent. Therefore, we have to attempt to defeat this regressive move of constitutional reforms. Are the leaders of incumbent government going to make this change because their progressive thinking urges them to do so? No. We cannot expect such a progressive change from politicians with the support among people with extreme xenophobic nationalist ideas. But personal reasons have compelled them to make this change, even though it is inconsistent with their ideology. In case dual citizenship has not become a barrier for some members of the ruling family oligarchy for their mobility in politics, we cannot expect such a progressive change with the 20th Amendment. But it is important to bear in mind that lawmakers of the pro-democratic side have made a serious mistake. The supporters of authoritarianism are going to rectify it. But whenever we, the people of pro-democratic side, get the opportunity to introduce a realistic and a fair constitution for the country in future, we have to be vigilant to stop the repetition of such mistakes. A noble being's loyalty crosses all boundaries and aspires to go beyond the frontiers of the Milky Way. Victory for freedom, democracy, and internationalism. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dimal, for your noteworthy presentation. Our next speaker is Professor S.I. Keita Ponchalan from the United States. He received his doctorate in conflict resolution from Nova Southeastern University in Florida. He is currently professor and chair of the Department of Conflict Resolution Studies at Salisbury University in Maryland. Formerly, he was professor of political science and chair of the Department of Political Science and Public Policy at the University of Colombo. He has served as a researcher in several international institutions, including the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research and the United Nations University in Tokyo. He has published widely on conflict and peace-related issues in Sri Lanka and South Asia. Let us warmly welcome Professor Keita Ponchalan to make his presentation.
Let me start by thanking Mr. Lionel Bopage and the group for giving me an opportunity to register my reservation about the 20th Amendment. In 1978, President J.R. Jayawardena introduced one of the most authoritarian-friendly constitutions in the world. Since then, we have seen the consequences of that constitution. Almost all former presidents, with the possible exception of Dingari Banda Wijayatunga, the president, have abused constitutional powers for their own political interest. However, in terms of democracy and democratic governance, we have made some progress, gains, especially through the 17th Amendment and the 19th Amendment. The current 20th Amendment, in my view, cancels all those gains. Therefore, it has a serious problem. Therefore, it should be reconsidered and should be brought under an acceptable democratic framework. At the same time, I accept that there is a need for a new amendment, a 20th Amendment, because there are some serious problems in the current constitution, including the amendments introduced in the recent past. For example, I think the Constitutional Council has some serious problems, should be reframed. Therefore, there is a need for a 20th Amendment, but a different 20th Amendment. In terms of the Tamil concerns, compared to the rest of the country, Tamils are not very concerned about the 20th Amendment, as far as I understand. The political parties, for example, the TNA and the Tamil Makkal National Front, have declared their opposition. At the grassroots level, at the societal level, I don't see much of an excitement within the Tamil community about the 20th Amendment. I think there are two reasons for less concern within the Tamil community. One, the 20th Amendment, the present 20th Amendment, does not have any anti-Tamil provisions. It doesn't deal with the structure of the state. It doesn't deal with, for example, the 13th Amendment. Therefore, there is no anti-Tamil major element in the bill. Number two, constitutional guarantees would not automatically guarantee Tamil interest. If a motivated government want to act against Tamil interest, they can do regardless of the constitution. The point is, a totally democratic constitution would not automatically guarantee Tamil interests. That depends on the attitude of the government and the attitude of the people in the south. And I think these two reasons influence Tamils to, not get very excited about the current draft. However, there is a need for a reformulation, and Tamil should be concerned specifically for two reasons. One, Tamils need some minimum guarantees. A good constitution, a democratic constitution could be a minimum guarantee. Therefore, Tamil should work towards ensuring that there is a democratic constitution and work with single leaders. And number two, the Tamil concerns are mainly about the new constitution. Although they are not very concerned about the 20th Amendment, they are very concerned about the possible new constitution that would probably come after the ratification of the 20th Amendment. The new constitution most probably deal with the structure of the state and also deal with the 13th Amendment, and there is a possibility that 13th Amendment would be fully or partially removed. In that sense, the Tamils are concerned about the new constitution that is coming. If the government, the present government, successfully without any problems approves the current 20th Amendment, they will go into the new constitution making with confidence and also could undermine Tamil interests. Therefore, as a preventive measure, they should be concerned about the 20th Amendment. But how to do that? It's only way to do that would be to work with the southern leaders who are concerned about it and working towards ensuring democracy in Sri Lanka. And I hope the Tamil political parties and Tamil people would be a part of that process. And I also believe or expect that the current government would understand the concerns raised from various quarters, including the religious leaders, some political factors, and also ethnic communities about the current draft. And when it comes to Parliament, they would reformulate, rethink, and reintroduce a new draft that would satisfy most democracy-loving Sri Lankans, including myself. And I hope for the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Keetha Panchalan, for your informative presentation. Our last speaker is Mr. Dharmasena Yakandawala from Vancouver, Canada. It is early morning over there. Mr. Yakandawala is a barrister and solicitor in Canada and the founder and chairperson of YLD Canada Immigration and Recruitment Services Limited. He is a full member of the Immigration Consultants of Canada Regulatory Council. Mr. Yakandawala is a law graduate from the University of Colombo and later served in the bar of the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka. After an active practice in Sri Lanka and overseas, he served in the Judicial Service of Sri Lanka as a district judge and magistrate. He is an activist who is interested in rule of law, particularly on the aspect of conflict of interest. He has sent a pre-recorded presentation and we will share it now.
Thank you so much for Dr. Lionel for having me in this forum. Today I will speak about how the rule of law is undermined through the rule by law. Before I begin my talk, I would like to first mention that we should not treat the symptom, but we should find the root cause of a problem and treat the root cause of that particular problem. The 20th Amendment is a symptom, not a root cause of a problem. So treating root cause of the problem is very important rather than treating the symptoms. So, in my speech, I will discuss some elements of rule of law as well as some elements of rule by law. And thereafter, I will let you determine whether the Sri Lankan justice system, Sri Lankan political system, is governing with the system of rule of law or rule by law. So at the end, I will explain what I feel that we should do in order for the country to be directed into the right direction. Now I will turn to understand certain elements of the rule of law. Rule of law is a constitutional principle which has deeper and wider meaning. So there are various elements in the principle of rule of law. I will explain you 4 elements only in this speech because I don't have enough time to talk about it. So first thing that I would like to explain is that in a country where the rule of law is existing, that country create and maintain of an actual order of positive laws to govern the society. First element is that all the laws that the government create and execute must be positive laws. So later I will come on to understand what is positive law. So number one thing that we need to see is that the law must be positive. Number two, all people, no matter ordinary citizen or people who are in power, must be under the law. The supremacy of the law is very important. If a country is a country with a system of rule of law, then the supreme power has the law. Not the president, not the parliament, or not even the Supreme Court, but the law itself. So therefore the supremacy should be given to the law. And it associates with the concept of natural law. So I will explain you what is natural law later on my speech. And it precludes the influence of arbitrary power. When the government is using arbitrary power, there should be a mechanism to preclude or to control the government in enacting and executing arbitrary laws. So that is where the Supreme Court is existing. And in the Supreme Court, there are some constitutional principles, particularly we use them in Canada. Supreme Court of Canada usually use some principles called unwritten principles of constitution. These unwritten principles of constitution give wider power to the Supreme Court to interpret the law when it comes to the government abuse the law or abuse the system or arbitrarily use the legal system. So the court has an inherent power to create laws. But unfortunately in Sri Lanka, we don't see the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka use these kind of terms. It's very sad. Next, I will explain you how we can identify a system is with rule by law. In a country where government is ruling a country by law, that particular country is the people who are in power is above the law. You can see always the governing people are above the law. I don't need to explain this to you. When you look at Sri Lankan system, always the people who are in power is behaving in the society as they are above the law. The other element is that most of the people in the country, vast majority of the people in the country is law-abiding citizens, where some powerful people as well as the people who are associated with these powerful people are always breaking the law. Sometimes they do this with a malicious intention. So if you look at the Sri Lankan system today, even at present, one former minister is missing when the court ordered to arrest him. So is he a responsible person? This is a natural practice in Sri Lanka. So these are the elements that we can see in a system of government that rule use to govern this country. So now you would be able to understand Sri Lanka has a system that use rule by law. The other element in a system of rule by law is that it is a method that the government and people who are in power use to shape the behavior of the people in terms of governing a country. So they use the law to shape the behavior of the people. It's a method that the people who are in power to use these kind of laws. The other element is that they pass the laws where they find it is convenient for them to do certain things that they want. So throughout our Sri Lankan history, you can see that most of the government are passing the laws for the sake of their benefit. The ultimate goal of a rule by law system is that psychologically or forcefully persuading people to agree with the policy decisions that they are making. Otherwise, the general public would not agree with. So it's a psychological or influential method that the people who are in power to use for the benefit of them in order to run the country and always to be in the power. So now I would like to invite you to look at 20th Amendment under the lens of rule of law as well as rule by law. These rights are explained in part 3 of the Constitution of Sri Lanka. You can look at them. So we talk about the positive law. What are the principles associated with the positive law? Positive law is made by the lawmakers. The parliament is supposed to make positive laws, not the negative laws. Positive laws has some certain elements that we can understand whether it's a positive law or negative law. In order a law to be a positive law, as I mentioned earlier, these laws must not step on the natural rights of the people. And it is based on the majority rule. What that means is that the best interest of the public should be maintained properly. And it should be based on the justice, political justice, economical justice, and social justice. So it should be based on the principle of justice. And it always should respect the principle of natural justice. If it does not respect the principles of natural justice, then that particular system is not a positive law.
Thank you, Mr. Akandavela, for the enlightening presentation you prepared for this event. The last item of today's event is to present the vote of thanks. Mr. Larry Marshall is a proud Sri Lankan who has been working for interfaith respect and cultural inclusivity in the Sri Lankan community for many years. He coordinated large Harmony Day celebrations for Sri Lankans living in Melbourne. He has worked in universities and also via the Uniting Church in Australia. He is a Vice President of the Australian Advocacy for Good Governance in Sri Lanka. I am very pleased to invite Mr. Larry Marshall to present the vote of thanks on behalf of the Defend Democracy in Sri Lanka collective. I also take this opportunity to thank him for undertaking to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lionel. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to first thank Dr. Lionel Bopagay and his merry band of helpers who have worked enormously hard to put together an online meeting in the middle of a COVID crisis and with technology that doesn't always do the things that we want. So Lionel and friends, please accept our thanks. We've had over 100 people within the Zoom meeting, and we've had speakers from Sri Lanka, as you have heard, from Australia, from New Zealand, from the UK, from Switzerland and Canada. And I think overall, we've had the benefit of hearing a broad cross-section of good argument, some historical, some very current, about the extreme danger of an amendment that would undermine our democracy, would weaken Parliament, would give exclusive rights to the president, and really prevent a pluralistic, people-oriented community from developing in Sri Lanka. And to have all these voices from around the world obviously makes us very proud to see the level of thinking and capacity in our community to fight against the 20th Amendment. I thank you all for joining us tonight. I thank our speakers in particular for working hard to present their arguments and to being with us at different hours of the day from different parts of the world. And I think this movement now to call for a new constitution rather than for these amendments and trying to fiddle with them is probably a good idea. And I see from some of the chat that it may be something that's coming to fruition as we speak in Sri Lanka. So once again, thank you to all the speakers. Thank you for making this a really worthwhile couple of hours together. And please go away from here empowered by what they've shared with us. And remember that you've got to keep talking. We've got to keep talking to our fellow Sri Lankans about these issues so that it can help to change what's going on in Sri Lanka and keep this pluralism and democracy that we treasure so much. Thank you, Lana.